Okay, greetings class and welcome to lecture number 4, English Colonies in the 18th Century. And it's during this time period that you see what would become America. The colonies are really starting to mature. Ready to go to the next slide? The English transatlantic communities of trade. Ready for the next slide? Regions of commerce, because basically that's how England viewed us, and to a large part that's how we viewed ourselves. Now the biggest area of commerce were the Caribbean colonies, the sugar islands. I mean, they were big money. Indeed, if you had a sugar plantation back then, it would be equal to you having as much wealth as if you owned a producing oil well on your own land. And you owned everything. So you were making all that money. Indeed, Jamaica's 1750 population of 210,000 was larger than all of the mainland colonies, except for Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. Barbados was second in population with 88,000. Now, most of these were African slaves who described their hellish labor in the great boiling houses where they converted the sugar cane to sugar. Next, we'll go to the Lower South. Now, if you remember, the Lower South, they produced rice in places like South Carolina. Indeed, by the 1730s, the rice grown in the Lower South fed the people of the Mediterranean, Portugal, and Spain. Once again, this should come as no surprise. I say Chesapeake, you say tobacco. Tobacco was the big money crop of the Chesapeake, even though there was a tobacco depression in 1720 where the government tried to regulate tobacco production and telling people they could only grow so much. The people revolted against that and even burned down some of the tax collection houses. So the government learned what the government does. If you want to stop the people from doing something, raise taxes on it. So basically the government says if you grow more than X amount of tobacco, you're going to have to pay X amount of tax to the government. And so basically it wasn't worth the money to grow that extra tobacco. And it led to a little bit of crop diversification. But still, the big money is in tobacco. And as you can guess, the bulk of their trade was directly with England. Now, what about New England? Well, they had to do a lot of different things. Basically, they concentrated on like fishing, timber, shipbuilding, and international commerce. And not only international commerce, but they also did domestic commerce that was intercolonial. As in like going from Massachusetts down to South Carolina, up to Maryland, over to Rhode Island. That was called the carrying trade. Which actually, more goods were carried in the carrying trade, even though it was more profitable to take those goods across to England. The middle colonies, meanwhile, they focus on wheat and overseas trade. They also provided like wood, flaxseed that was transported to Ireland by 1775. Philadelphia had become the second largest city in all of the British Empire. meaning that there was only one city that was bigger, London. That's kind of amazing. And finally, you have the backcountry people. This was like way out on the frontier. I mean, that's where most of the immigrants went and everything like that. And it was very sparsely populated. It's kind of seen as the invasion line by Native Americans. And as they lacked a transportation system to get their goods to market, pretty much they had to just grow sustenance level things like grain that they and their family could eat and stuff like that. Life was very tough for the people out in the backcountry. The chords of commercial empire. Alright guys, once again, there's not any words on this slide. Let me give you all a little opportunity to write that down, the chords of commercial empire. What you need to know about this, though, is that the majority of America's trade was with England. I mean, Britain bought 50% of the crops, furs, and minerals that they needed. Meanwhile, we buy 90% of the goods that we need from the British. So there's a little bit of reliance one on the other. Now, of course, also remember we had that carrying trade going on where the colonials traded extensively with each other. As I told you before, it was actually greater in volume than the overseas trade, but not as profitable. Kind of like Greyhound bus lines probably takes more travelers in America than American Airlines takes trips to Europe, takes a flight to Europe, but American Airlines probably makes more money off that flight to Europe than Greyhound bus does taking passengers from Dallas over to Little Rock, Arkansas. Ready for the next slide? Community and work in colonial society. In this section, basically, we're going to get a little bit more into how the different regions that we established with the last lecture, about how those societies are forming up. And the first one that we'll talk about is, ready to go to the next slide? The emergence of the Yankee. This is up in Massachusetts and all. And basically you had a wealthy merchant elite that had arisen in the seaporn towns by the end of the 17th century. And their economic success had replaced most of their older values. But one that remained was their belief in education. Now, what problems were they facing? Well, basically, they didn't have the land to give to sons and everything like that. Basically, it was pretty filled up. So, a lot of people had to leave to try to, or either go west out to the frontier, or go north to like Maine. Meanwhile, you also had big cities like Boston, where you had growing numbers of widows and young men trying to go there and find work, like become an apprentice, like a blacksmith or a rope maker. And they had to go on public welfare. And as news of employment scarcity kind of spreads, settlers stopped wanting to go there. Ready for the next slide? Then you have plants of society and slavery. This is in the Chesapeake and the lower South. And decade that's very important is the 1680s. Before the 1680s and up to 1688, most of the labor was done by white indentured male servants. After the Glorious Revolution, though, people stopped wanting to come over here, and more the reliance comes on buying slave labor. Now, some things that were helping this out is the drawbacks to African slavery began to vanish. Like as early as 1662, a law was put on the books which legalized that slave children were slaves. They used to be free before that. Also, you had like mortality rates in the Chesapeake fell. In other words, if you bought a slave, he'd be living for a long time. Kind of make it worth the expense. England had broken the Dutch monopoly over the slave trade, which drove the prices down and ensured a steady number of slaves. Now, as you can see on that map there, has those arrows with the larger the arrow means the greater number of slaves going to a region. Most of the slaves, 60% went to the Sugar Islands. North America up here, we only got 5%. I'll use this. North America, where'd it go? I can't find my mouse. There it is. So most of the 60% of the slaves go to the Sugar Islands and the West Indies. North America, we only get 5% of the slaves. And we're also the only region where the slaves had a positive birth rate, meaning that there were more slaves being born and living than there were dying. On places like the Sugar Island, they were basically they worked the slaves to death. But now that more slaves were needed here in America, in the Chesapeake, the number of slaves grew from 950 in 1660 to more than 120,000 slaves by 1756. Indeed, the whole prosperity of the region becomes tied to slave labor. Now, of course, as you can guess, there was slave resistance to this. I had a slide of this, but I think it got deleted accidentally somehow. And something called the Stono Rebellion. Stono Rebellion happened down in Charleston, South Carolina. You had rumors of war that might break out between Spain and England, as well as a yellow fever epidemic that was making everybody on edge. And basically 20 slaves met by the Stono River. They seized guns and powders and killed several planters and started heading south down to Spanish Florida. Now, of course, the whole way they were beating drums, calling out for other slaves to come join them. And their numbers grew to almost 100. But by late Sunday afternoon, they were surrounded by a white militia and surrounded. The slaves put up a huge fight, but all of the slaves were massacred. And of course, as a consequence to this, there's even more paranoia in the South. You start to have an increase in slave patrols, limitations to the movement of slaves, as well as an increased bounty for runaway scalps. Ready for the next slide? The urban culture of the Middle Colonies. Now guys, big cities in the middle colonies was something that was very distinctive to them. Indeed, they had the two largest cities over here. One was Philadelphia. That was the largest at 40,000. Making it the second largest city in the entire British Empire. New York was second with 25,000. Now guys, remember that number because that's going to come up important when we get into our lecture about the American Revolution. Ready to go to the next slide? Now guys, why would you want to go to the city? I mean, in New York, people lived with chickens and livestock, and on the streets there were roving packs of dogs and pigs. At seaport towns, the ships carried rats, which carried vermin, and they also carried sailors, which had venereal diseases of their own. Fires would burn rapidly. You had taverns and gambling houses that abounded. Well, I mean, why would people go there? Well, the reason why people go to cities, and still go to cities today, is because of the opportunities. I mean, if you were a young man, you could get a job as an apprentice and part of a specialized workforce, like a blacksmith, like a, I forgot what the name of the barrel makers are. A barrel maker. If you were a woman, you could get employment as a milliner, which is a designer of hats. So even though only about 3% of the population lived in cities, they became a magnet for widows, the young, and for free African Americans. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, of course, also in the middle colonies, you did have racial tension, because there were some slaves in the middle colonies. For example, in New York City. Now, a lot of people might think, what the heck did they have slaves in New York City for? Oh, which, by the way, also had the highest concentration of African Americans in the northern colonies. Well, basically, they did work as the dock workers, loading up the ships, taking goods off the ships, etc. And in about 1712, 24 slaves were sick of it. They wanted to basically escape. So they had a plan. They were all going to bring rags and everything like that. They were going to put them inside this little hut on the docks, and they were going to set the rags on fire, which would catch the hut on fire. And while everybody was struggling to put out that fire, the 24 slaves said, hey, we're going to make our escape then. Well, it may have sounded like a good idea, but if any of you guys have ever been to Houston or any seaport town, the humidity is incredible. Indeed, in Houston, the humidity is so bad that if your newspaper that's delivered to your house isn't wrapped in one of those plastic baggies, it's going to be ruined because it's going to be so soaked by the time you get up to go pick it out. Well, they bring all these rags and what used to be dry, but it's all wet because of that humidity. And if anybody here has tried to burn like wood that was just taken off a tree, it's called green wood because it's still got all the sap and everything in it. It doesn't really want to start on fire. It kind of smokes a lot, and like I said, doesn't want to get on fire, doesn't hold the flame. So these guys are trying to light it. A lot of smoke is being created, but nothing to keep the fire going, which alerts the nearby people, oh my gosh, these guys are trying to do something, and come over. Now, some of the slaves freak out because they know they're going to get in trouble, so they go ahead and kill themselves. Other ones, however, were caught, and according to the governor, Robert Hunter, he said, some were burnt, others were hung, one broke on the wheel, and one hung alive in the chains of the town. And of course, they try to pass laws to make sure that slaves could never do this again. They say, like, any slave carrying a firearm would receive 20 lashes. Any slave caught gambling would be whipped in public. If you were involved in a conspiracy to kill, you'd be executed, as would rape. And if somebody wanted to free a slave, they had to put a $200 bond down on the slave with the city in case he got up to mischief. Now, did those laws do a job preventing another uprising? Well, guys, less than 29 years later, in 1741, at the mere rumor of a slave revolt, more than 101 of the city slaves were arrested. 18 were hung and 18 were burned alive. Ready to go to the next slide? Okay. Okay, life in the backcountry. Now, guys, most of the immigrants in the 18th century just went out and settled in the backcountry, here in the middle colonies. Like in New York, their population rose 39% by 1760, more than 700,000 new colonists. Most of these guys were from Scotland or Ireland, had left to come over here to America. Indeed, so many immigrants flowed out of Great Britain that there was talk of passing a law in England to limit how many people could leave. And of course, this flood of immigrants, oh, and by the way, up in New England, they would put up signs saying no Scots or Irish allowed. In other words, in New England, the Scots and Irish couldn't even settle up there. And as they were moving out west, the sons of older families in the east also were searching for land, would join them. Everybody got it? Okay. And as you can guess, the residents out in the backcountry often were at conflict with colonial governments. Like disputes over the Indian policy gave rise to like Pennsylvania's Paxton Boys, who in 1763, tired of Indian attack, they attacked a friendly Indian village, then marched on Philadelphia to demand changes. Philadelphia's Benjamin Franklin goes out as a representative for Philadelphia. And you see a shift in Pennsylvania's Indian policy, where it used to be one of peace, and now a higher bounty, or a bounty at all, would be paid for Indian scalps by the government. Now, guys, it's not just limited to Pennsylvania. I mean, in South Carolina, you had the regulators that objected to insufficient governmental services in the backcountry. So they rise up and say they're going to take matters into their own hands. North Carolina's regulators, they began an armed rebellion because of corrupt officials. All right. Reason and religion in 18th century colonial society. Now in this section, basically we're going to be talking about what's going on culturally here in America. Ready for the next slide? Now, where you got to look at for the growth of culture is the cities. This is where you have the wealthy elite trying to copy the ideas of merry old Europe, getting the latest plays and such, like the latest, they try to copy their architecture, their plays, import European furniture. And this all happens at the ports. And not only are the wealthy guys getting all the newest philosophies and stuff like that, but also the common guy is talking to the guys from Europe, the sailors from Europe and everything like that. So you have this whole cultural transference going on there. Now the first thing we got to look at is the impact of the Enlightenment. And the American colonials were very influenced by the ideas of the European Enlightenment, which basically stressed that through reason you could have progress. Now before this, many of the people had believed in the teachings of like Thomas Hobbes, who believed that everybody was created evil, and that the state of nature was equal to a state of war. But instead, now, one had to take a study of logic and look at nature for the rules on how to unsolve problems. A lot of these guys that did this were deists, following the philosophies that included like Newton, John Locke, Voltaire, David Hume. Ready for the next slide? Oh, and by the way, the deists did believe in God, but a distant God. In other words, a God that had created all the rules of nature and everything, and then he let that work out for itself. Kind of like they saw God as a watchmaker. And, you know, God built the watch, and he built within it all the rules to keep time. In other words, God didn't have to force the second hand to move every second. He had already built the watch with the rules to basically run itself. And if God, let's say my watch right now says 1:40, if God put the watch down, went away for 5 minutes, came back, it would say 1:45. And God wasn't there twisting every second. No, he had made the rules to let that watch function. So deists kind of have this view of, yeah, there is a God, but he's a distant God. Well, what are we supposed to do to uncover the rules of nature? And that will be discussed in the next slide. Y'all ready? Basically, like I said, according to the beliefs of the Enlightenment, God created the scientific rules of nature. Humans were basically good, and nature was to be studied and applied. Because if you break the rule of nature, the only result is going to be human misery and problems. Now, just as an example, I'll give it on the next slide. Just as an example of keeping the rule of nature, let's say you have the wealthiest woman in all of Plano, who's Jewish, and she has a plant. Meanwhile, you have the poorest guy in all of Plano. All he has, he's Asian. All he has is a plant. If he waters that plant every day and gives it sun, it's going to grow. If the wealthiest woman gives her plant sun and water every day, it's going to grow. If, however, the wealthy woman stops giving that plant water, it's going to die. Now wait a minute, does that have anything to do with the fact that she's wealthy? No. Does it have anything to do with the fact that she's Jewish? No. Does it have anything to do with the fact that she's a woman? No. The plant died because she broke the law of nature. Same thing with the Asian guy. If he stops watering his plant, it dies. Is it because he's Asian? No. Is it because he's poor? No. Is it because he's a man? No. It's you break the law of nature, bad things are going to happen. Ready to go to the next slide? So one of the ways that ideas were tested back then is you'd take an idea from one area and you'd try to apply it to other areas. And this is where we get into John Locke's social contract theory. Now this is very important because it's kind of one of the bases of our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, because he took the laws of the Enlightenment and tried to apply it to society and government. In 1690, he published an essay concerning human understanding. In 1691, he published 2 treatises on government. Basically, Locke wrote that all human beings have natural rights that cannot be taken away. These rights include the right to owning oneself, the right to the produce of their own labor, indeed, he believed that we were born with the right to life, liberty, and property. And every single one of us is born with that. And guys, if we were the only one in the world, there'd be no problem with you having all the rights in the world. The problem comes when you meet somebody else. And when you can't have total freedom, I have to stop at a red light and wait till it's green to go. We create governments to protect our rights within a social contract, where some of our liberties are given up in order to protect others. So in other words, if I come to an intersection and the light is red, the light is red, I have to stop. I don't care that my taxes went to pay for the streets. It doesn't matter that I bought all that gas. It doesn't matter that I own my own car and insurance. I still have to stop. If I go through it, I will hurt somebody's property, and hopefully not life, and I have to pay a recompense, and the government is there to make sure that that's done. And as governments are created, it has a duty to protect its citizens' natural rights. And people have a right, a duty, to rebel against a government which does not protect those rights. In other words, once the government starts taking away rights that we have not given it, according to Locke, we have a right to rebel against that government. Ready to go to the next slide? The goal of the Enlightenment. Basically, the goal of the Enlightenment is to keep on examining nature's laws, to try to figure out what's going on. And progress is going to eventually solve all problems. Now, guys, this is one of the reasons why Americans, as a whole, are incredibly optimistic. And even if you guys think, oh, we're not that optimistic. Guys, yes, we are. We're still searching for cures for cancers and diseases and everything to try to help. And we think we can do it. Even though many of these we may have been fighting against for a long time. Also, because we always believe there's going to be progress, we have incredible technological advances that have been made. Almost meteoric. I mean, in all areas. Ready to go to the next slide? Okay, so you have the Enlightenment, which is very mental. Well, now you have stuff that's going on spiritually. Basically, religious tolerance grew as the number of Protestant sects, S-E-C-T-S, in the colonies increased. So as we're having more and more people come in from other places, they're going to have a different denomination. In other words, if you have a neighborhood, everybody's a Baptist that lives there, and then all of a sudden, a Methodist moves in down the street. Well, you know, one day you might have walked out, you got a flat tire, it's raining, you got to change that tire to get to work, you're starting to unscrew the lug nuts on the wheel, all of a sudden you don't feel the rain anymore. You look up and there's that Methodist neighbor holding an umbrella over your head. And he says, can I help you out? Well, you get to talking, you find out that his beliefs aren't really that different from yours. And you start inviting him over to your house, you know, to thank him for dinner. He brings his wife, and y'all get to talking and everything like that. And so you do begin to tolerate each other. Now, of course, this toleration did not extend to Catholics who weren't even allowed to vote or hold elected office until Baltimore in Maryland, that colony that was supposed to be their refuge, in 1763, they broke the law and built a Catholic church. Now, even though you have all this toleration, established churches remain. So this toleration did not extend to a separation of the church and state. Now, why did this happen? Well, because people, especially in the South, had always had the tradition of an established church, where people were taxed by the government to support the official church of that region. For example, here in Texas, if we had an established church, it would probably be the Baptist church. So even if you were a Methodist or a Presbyterian or Muslim or Buddhist, you would still pay a tax that would go to the Baptist church, because that had always happened. Well, one of the consequences of this toleration, like if the Baptist guy realizes that his Methodist neighbor really isn't that much difference than him, you kind of have a growing indifference to church. And so some people stop going. While the church still needs services done around the church. In other words, they need someone to lead Sunday school. They need someone to take care of the kids. They need someone to help out with meetings or lunches. And they go to women to help them out. And women become even more involved in the churches, because this is one of the few areas where they can have a little respect. Ready to go to the next slide? The Great Awakening. Basically, Jonathan Edwards was an excellent example of the homegrown preacher in the North who reminded his congregants that they were nothing more than sinners in the hands of an angry God in the 1730s. That he just held them over a raging fire, and at any time he could let go of the web. So they better get on their knees and be humble before God. Y'all ready for the next slide? And fiery preaching was incredibly important to this movement. Perhaps the greatest preacher of all was the visiting George Whitefield back in 1740. He was a traveling preacher who toured from Charleston all the way up to Maine. He had been a member of the Holy Club at Oxford, where he and other students, hey, in order to succeed and graduate from this, it was called the Holy Club. And basically they said, look, we've got to find out a method to success. So every day they would, from 6:15 to 6:23, we're going to walk to the breakfast hall. From 6:24 to 6:28, we're going to pray. From 6:28 to and so on. Everything was regimented, and they'd have to follow this method. And a member of this Holy Club was John Wesley. And upon graduating from Oxford, while George Whitefield became a traveling preacher, John Wesley also became a church leader. A church leader that also had its own method to salvation. The Methodists. Now, Whitefield was incredibly charismatic. And he was quite humorous. One of his best friends was Benjamin Franklin. They carried on a lively correspondence. Whitefield would say, "Oh, have you accepted the Lord yet?" And Ben Franklin would say, "No." And they'd laugh. And by the way, Benjamin Franklin was a devout deist. But they still were great friends. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, of course, this revival movement did cause conflict. You had traditional clergymen and the wealthy that kind of resented this new group. They saw it as a tax on them. These controversies transformed into political positions and class tensions. Basically, everything was the old lights, that was the old church, and the awakeners, that were the new group coming up. Here you can see one of the old lights propaganda pieces against the awakeners. You see here's the pastor preaching. Here's an angel kind of looking away. There's the devil whispering into his ear. Down here you see the congregants. They're tubbing over this one thing of goods that a lady has brought in. This other guy's trying to hit on the women. Their music minister right there has a dog's head. Oh, here are the guys that are hitting on women. I mean, it just looks like total debauchery, because these two things are so different. And don't get me wrong, it was a scary time. I mean, you might have nightly book burnings. The old lighters would comment on because of the fiery preaching. The old lighters said that it made the women, enthralled them into fervors. What's the result of this? Well, you have new colleges established, right? Rutgers, Brown, Princeton, and Dartmouth, that were basically seminaries, but also offered other classes to create a whole education. But more importantly, it encouraged people who at first had remained silent. They had to speak. I mean, you had to be on one side or the other. And also, this thing was the first national thing that gave the congregants a sense to belonging of something outside of their own little area. For example, like say you were a Baptist in Virginia, and at the next Sunday meeting, the pastor would get up and say, well, our church in Rhode Island is having a lot of trouble right now. We're going to take up a collection to give them a love offering to help them out, because they got caught in a storm and they need their roof repaired. So all of a sudden they're connected to a colony in Rhode Island, something they never would have thought of before. And guys, does that still happen today? Yeah. If y'all remember Hurricane Katrina, when it hit New Orleans, the first boots on the ground out there to help out the people were churches. I mean, if you remember here in Dallas, you had churches from all denominations loading up the beds of trucks, taking fresh water out to the victims and other forms of aid, food. Once again, we belong to something outside of ourselves. Ready to go to the next slide? Government and politics in the mainland colonies. And this is where you see the growth of two separate kind of ideas. Ready to go to the next slide? Now what's important to know is the year 1696. Basically, the British Empire was reorganized and the Board of Trade was created, which passed tons of new taxes and laws, like the Navigation Acts of 1722, the White Pines Act of 1711, 1722, and 1729, the Molasses Act and Sugar Act of 1733, the Hatton Felt Act of 1732, and the Iron Act of 1750. Now guys, I'm going to go over all of those taxes a little bit more in the next slide. So make sure you have the British Empire was reorganized in 1696, Board of Trade formed, tons of new taxes and laws. Okay, ready to go to the next slide? Okay, so the Navigation Acts, if y'all remember, that said that certain products could only be taken to England. Well, they added furs to the list of restricted goods that could only be taken to England in 1722. The White Pines Act limited how many white pines could be chopped down so that they'd be reserved as naval stores for British ships. The Molasses Act and Sugar Act increased the taxation on sugar. And the Iron Act of 1750 limited colonial production. In other words, it said the colonies, you can't make that much iron. Now, wait a minute, why would England... Oh, and the Hat and Felt Act said that we couldn't make hats and regulated how much felt we could produce. Now, why did England pass those laws? Well, the reason why England passed those laws is because it needed to have jobs for its own people in England. Kind of like when Trump said that he put those tariffs on Chinese steel. He wanted to try to give steel over here in America a better chance of reviving itself so that more Americans could be hired there. Now, how could China get around the tariff? Well, they could build their factory over here in America. They'd have to hire Americans, but they would be providing more jobs. And has any other industry done that? Sure. Car companies. Here in America, we build Volkswagens, we build Mercedes, we build tons of foreign cars. Toyota here in Texas. And we have those car companies here because those foreign car companies want to get around the tariffs. And they're hiring Americans and paying good wages. Y'all ready to go to the next slide? Now you think that because all of these taxes are being passed, that it would be stifling us over here in America. Well, that may have been, but none of this stuff is ever really enforced. Why isn't it enforced? Well, authority over the colonies remained totally divided among many agencies in the British government. And with the British government, so much of the limits and division of powers was unwritten. You were just supposed to kind of know where the limits were. I mean, yeah, the monarch was at the top, House of Lords and the House of Commons below that. But nobody really knew who and how far they could go. So in order to avoid being rude, they wouldn't do something. Because certainly that's that other officer or that other department's duty. Yes, yes, yes. So a lot of this stuff doesn't even get enforced. And indeed, America's, even though the laws are on the books, they should be being enforced, they're not. So what is America left in? Well, America's left in a period of salutary neglect. Which means you kind of turn a blind eye to the law. The law isn't, it's on the books, but it's not really enforced. And some of you guys have been beneficiaries of salutary neglect. For example, I'm sure a lot of you have driven down to Austin. We're on I-35 now. The speed limit can be as high as 80 miles an hour. And some of you might have discovered that your car goes faster than 85. 80 miles an hour. You might have gone 85 or even a little faster. Until you see a cop car and you slow down. Only to discover that the cop car is going faster than you. But you still try to go the speed limit if you see a cop car. That's salutary neglect. Or yeah, you're breaking the law, but we're going to overlook it. So here in America, we get comfortable with none of these laws being enforced. We may not even know they're on the books. Ready for the next slide? Now over here in America, basically we have local colonial government, where at the head of this was the royal governor. Underneath him was a council and a local assembly. And the governor had huge, extensive powers. He could do almost anything. He'd been appointed by the king. But the royal governors are quick to learn, even though you have all these powers, don't exercise them. Why? Because it was the assemblies that paid the salaries. And it was also the assemblies that figured out the way things work in government. So if the governor started putting a lot of revenue ships out there to cut back on smuggling, well, you just made sure that that department got less money, so those guys wouldn't be happy. And you also might make sure that the governor's paycheck might come late, which would make him unhappy. So most of the governors learned you just go ahead and you kowtow to the local assembly, give them the power, and as you can guess, the local assemblies pretty much grow into a small, intimate, and somewhat permanent elite. In other words, if one guy was a councilman, his son wants to run, well, you knew that the dad did a great job, so you vote for the son. And the son goes, and if the son decides he wants to retire, well, you might want to vote for his uncle, who was the dad's brother, because, you know, it's all in there. And like I said, the local assemblies were voted into power by the colonials. So we get this really strong feeling of self-rule. Ready to go to the next slide? Conflicting views of the assemblies. Okay, conflicting views of the assemblies. Now guys, that whole time we were in a period of salutary neglect, you get two totally different views of the way the colonies should be run within the empire. Over here you had the colonial view, which saw basically a two-level system. England was in control of everything that should go along in the empire, and the local assemblies should basically have self-governance over here and what goes on in the colonies. And this was justified by the fact that over here we had actual representation, or the people voted for their officials. So they actually took part in the process. Now to the English, no, oh no. There was only a single system, yes? England was supposed to be over everything. And basically America was represented by the House of Parliament, by the parliamentarians, either the House of Lords or the House of Commons, which is the English Parliament. And while some Americans might say, hey, what are you talking about? We didn't take part in that election. The British would say, oh, no. You know, they virtually represent you. So virtually you did take a part in that election, because your parliamentarian stands for you. Now, if you have these two different sides seeing things different ways, what's going to bring these two different views into conflict? Well, war. North America and the struggle for empire. That's going to bring the British over here, and that's going to see them wanting more and more to enforce that single view. Now the first thing, because we're getting ready to talk about a whole bunch of wars, the first thing we'll look at is Indian alliances and rivalries. Now, many of the Indian tribes had formed alliances with the colonials to assist the newcomers, to protect their own safety, advance their own interests, and help defeat local rivals. However, if this alliance came into a conflict with imperial rivalries and goals, then basically the imperial goals would win. And they'd have to break some of those peace treaties, which of course once the war was over, the British were gone, colonials didn't like too much. Neither did the Native Americans. Ready for the next slide? Okay. An age of imperial warfare. Now, the first four of 5 wars fought by England, France, and Spain really did not too much except anger the American colonies. Ready to go to the next slide? Now guys, you don't have to write a lot of notes on these wars that I'm going to be going through until we get to the big one. And when we get to the big one, no. Basically just write out like the big concepts. Like King William's War in 1689, it began in Europe over French control of Europe. France basically made guerrilla-style war on New England's frontier. For example, in July of 1689, you had 2 Indian women holding babies pled to Dover, New Hampshire, that was, in a fort, to, oh, let us in, we're cold and we have our kids. And the mayor went ahead and let them in, and everybody goes to sleep at night, except for those 2 Indian ladies. They went and they opened up the gates, allowing the Indian warriors to flood in and massacre the population. And then, of course, they do the exact same thing to another town 2 weeks later. Now, you did have colonial expeditions sent out to, capture Montreal, Quebec, Port Royal, all paid for by the colonials of that colony. And even though a peace treaty was signed, there were no real territorial gains made by either side. However, the conflicts don't stop, and they spread along the mainland colonies all the way to South Carolina. Now, if you want to write down something really important about this war, is that this is where the Iroquois League, or the Iroquois Confederacy, they favor the English, just as they had earlier the Dutch. And the Algonquin, or Huron League, Huron, favor the French. Ready to go to the next slide? Queen Anne's War. Basically, this was caused when Austria and France tried to claim some of Spain's territory. And in February 1704, more than 400 French and Indian allies attacked Deerfield, Massachusetts, where 54 villagers were killed and the settlement was burnt to the ground. William Shirley, the governor of Massachusetts, organizes a motley fleet to land soldiers there that laid siege to Deerfield. And on June 17th, the French surrender the fort. But they do try to expand to having more strategic land to kind of stymie English expansion towards the Mississippi River. Y'all ready for the next slide? Next is King George's War, or the War of Austrian Succession. Basically, the French had built Louisbourg, a huge fort on the island of on the Cape Breton Island. It was called the Gibraltar of the New World. It had they paid more than $6 million or francs to build the thing. Had walls 20 to 30 feet high, made out of thick stone. Had more than 100 cannon. And basically the colonists score a strategic victory over the French when they're able to capture it. But at the war's end, basically everything is given back. Which really angers the colonials, who had loaded up all these merchant ships with men, with army men or militiamen to go and take the fort, which they succeeded in doing. All right, ready to go to the next slide? Okay, this is where we need to start paying attention to notes again. Now, during the peace following this war, basically France really expands, trying to stop English expansion. If you see all the red dots on that map of North America over here, all those dots, red dots, basically it's new French forts that are built up. You have like Fort Detroit, Fort St. Louis, and right off of, right in Virginia's backyard, they build Fort Duquesne. Oop, let me go back. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, what's the colonial response to this? Well, the governor of Virginia cannot allow this fort to stand. So he gets a young general by the name of George Washington to lead out a militia unit and kick out the French. Well, they go out there and they build this fort right next to Fort Duquesne called Fort Necessity. And Fort Necessity was a great name for it because that fort needed everything. I mean, it wasn't close to fresh water, anything like that. And the French in 1754 are easily able to overrun the French 600 plus their Indian allies are easily able to overrun George Washington's 300 men on July 3rd, and he's forced to surrender. After this, and realizing and recognizing the need for the colonies to act together, Benjamin Franklin calls for delegates to appear in Albany, New York, in something known as the Albany Congress. basically in making what's been called the first American political cartoon. There you can see it right there. All these little pieces of a snake, like V is Virginia, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, New England. Basically, it's saying, look, everybody, we have to join together or we're going to die. Join or die. Why did they show a chopped up snake? Because it used to be believed that if you killed a snake, you had to chop off its head and then nail that head and chop the snake into a lot of little pieces and nail the head of the snake to a tree or something, because otherwise during the night all of those disunited pieces would join together and reform a snake and slither off dangerously into the night. Everybody got this? Now, at first, this seemed like a good idea, this whole, all the colonies acting together, but England thought of it as sedition. Going to the next slide. And basically, England said, no, we are here to fight for you. So what do? They dispatched General Edward Braddock, a guy who was obese, humorless, talentless, who led 2,500 redcoats out on a narrow road near Fort Duquesne. And he was worried that his Iroquois allies might desert, so he placed them in front, and he had all his men march behind. Well, of course, right in the middle of this path, where you got woods on both sides, they were struck by the enemy and attacked by this French and their Indian ally army. They can't pull their defensive together. More than 70% of his men are either killed or wounded before they're finally able to get back to safety. And the Iroquois that they didn't trust kind of laughed and said that this was the British introduction to war in America. Said on July 9th, 1755. And the sad thing is, there were only like 300 Indian and French that attacked them. But it was a total surprise. Ready to go to the next slide? So we have all these wars, and what are the results for the colonies? Well, basically, they saw taxes go up, they saw, or taxes be collected, they saw inflation happen, they had impressments, which means basically you would be forced to join the British Army or British Navy. And now that the British were over here, there was greater commercial regulation. Now all of a sudden they expect you to pay like the sugar tax and stuff like that. You got to knock out the smuggling. And of course the American colonials, they don't knock out the smuggling, but they have to find new ways to get around the British. Ready for the next slide? The Great War for Empire. Alright guys, this is a big mama. This is also known as the 7 Years' War, the French-Indian War. This is a huge conflict. Why? Because it's worldwide between England and France. It began in 1754, lasted until 1763. Because, guys, basically there were two superpowers in the world, England and France, and this was the war that was fought to see who was going to be the big dog. Y'all ready to go to the next slide? Now, if you look at the two nations at war, it looks like it's going to pretty much be for England. England had a population of 1.2 million. France, they only had a population of 75,000. But over here, the colonies were divided into local groups that were totally unwilling to work with each other. In other words, if I'm from Springfield, Massachusetts, I'm not going to fight with that guy from New Jersey. You know, I don't even know him. I'm not going to fight with that regiment of Providence from Rhode Island. I don't like them at all. Meanwhile, a big advantage to France was they had extensive alliances with Indian nations that brought their numbers significantly up. Ready to go to the next slide? Preparations for war. On May 18th, 1856, England officially declared war on France. William Pitt was put in charge, and he believed that the war should be expanded out of Europe. Pitt believed that the New World is where the war should be fought, and he got control over the Army and Navy, where his men were promoted on merit rather than their social standing. And they're going to come over here and give France what for? Well, that was in 1756. And as you can probably guess, this war starts out with a whole bunch of French victories over here in North America. Now, wait a minute. Why would the French win all this if England was going to war with them? Because, guys, William Pitt is in England. He has to get all that stuff and supply ready to get over here and actually bring it over here. That's going to take a lot of time. Kind of like in the modern days. We had the first Gulf War when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And we said, look, we're going to give you 4 months. You have until this deadline to get out of Kuwait. Now, why did we give them 4 months? Were we trying to be nice guys? Well, I mean, it does look good in the eyes of the world, but also we had to get everything we needed for the war over there. And that means not just the men, but also their rifles, their ammunition. We need the tanks, we need the trucks, we need the gas, we need the water, we need the food, we need every single thing they're going to eat. Oh, we need to bring all the tools to repair the running vehicles. We need to bring all the oil. We need a lot. And so even in the modern day, it's going to take a long time. French take total advantage of that and start out with some sweeping victories, pushing the English colonists back. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, by 1758, though, they're over here. Actually, they got here in late 1757. And one of the first things they do is capture Louisbourg, that Gibraltar of the New World. Well, guys, a consequence of the capture of Louisbourg is basically because that protects the entrance to the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is their main river that goes inland to Canada, delivering them things like trinkets to keep the Native Americans on their side. More important things like gunpowder. so that they can continue to fight the war. And now basically that we've cut their supply chain, the French start to abandon their forts left and right. Indeed, when they send a militia unit to go take over Fort Duquesne, they find it totally abandoned. Meanwhile, the British counterattack. For example, they capture the French city of Quebec. Basically, this was achieved by Wolfe. Took, kind of diverted the French attention and was able to get some of his men downstream, land them. In one night, they were able to march like the 2,000 feet up to the Plains of Abraham, which is a plateau on top of the mountain that Quebec City is built right behind. And they thought, hey, we've got a mountain there to protect us, so they didn't build a back wall. So basically, when the French woke up in the morning, they saw all these cannons pointed down at them and knew that the British could shell them to smithereens. And so they're able to capture it. And all of New France falls to the English over here in North America in 1760. Ready for the next slide? And basically France lost most of its possessions over here in the New World. Just to show you how valuable the Sugar Islands were, we told the French, you can either keep Guadeloupe and Martinique and give us all the land up here, or give us all the land up here and keep Guadeloupe and Martinique. They chose to keep Guadeloupe and Martinique. Meanwhile, so England wins all of this, but this war cost a lot of money. Indeed, they more than doubled their debt on helping to defend the colonies over here. They went from $12 million of debt to 26 million pounds worth of debt. And this, guys, is where things start to not get so rosy. Ready for the next slide? Now, what were the American activities in the war? Well, guys, we sent at least 20,000 troops of our own colonials over here. Like Massachusetts alone, they raised 5,000 men out of a population of 50,000. Well, that may not seem like a lot, but guys, if you look at that population of 50,000, you got to cut it in half, because there's men and there's women. Okay, so now we got 25,000 men. Well, you got to cut out a lot of that, because there are people that are too old to fight, and there are people that are too young to fight. So by Massachusetts contributing 5,000 men, basically 1 out of every 3 men who was of fighting age would have participated in this war. The American colonies over here, we spent more than $2 million of our own money helping to win the war. And during the war, because, hey, we're right there with Britain, we feel like we're part of a larger community. Ready for the next slide? Meanwhile, the English, well, they kind of look at us, and some Americans had continued to trade with the French during the war. I mean, if you can get a cask of gunpowder here in America, sell it up in New France for 40 bucks, a lot of people were taking that. Also, militarily, the American militiamen, we were the first to run. And we were the guys that were like shooting from behind trees and stuff like that, that basically we'd grown up fighting in North America. Ready for the next slide? Okay, don't worry about writing any of this down. But this is basically what a British general, James Wolfe, the same guy who had taken Quebec City, this is what he said of the Americans. The Americans are in general the dirtiest, most contemptible, cowardly dogs that you can conceive. There's no depending on them in action. They fall down in their own dirt and desert in battalions, officers and all. So I think that's his way of saying he's not too impressed by the Americans. Meanwhile, we're not so impressed by the British. First off, we find out they're not invincible. Also, we believe that the British behaved arrogantly. For example, troops were quartered or given housing, and goods were seized, all at colonial expense. Basically, the British would say, no, this is the king's house. We're the king's men. We're taking your house for our men to sleep in. Oh, and you can feed us while we're here, because that's the king's food, and we're the king's men. Hey. So basically, guys, as you can see, the tension is there. That leads us, starting next lecture, we're going to talk about a victorious British colony that by the end of, a lot of people are thinking, you know what, maybe we need to get out of this whole crazy thing and start ruling ourselves. So the next lecture is a very pivotal lecture for American history.